Jon Stewart has spent 3 decades making powerful people uncomfortable. He's dismantled politicians with a raised eyebrow, eviscerated media figures with a well-timed pause, and exposed hypocrisy with nothing more than common sense delivered in that signature deadpan. He left The Daily Show at the peak of his influence, returned when he felt the call, and continued doing what he's always done, asking the questions everyone's thinking but nobody's brave enough to say. So when Meghan Markle walked into his studio with a list of grievances and fire in her eyes, determined to finally confront the man who'd mocked her media strategy on national television, she made the same mistake everyone makes with Jon Stewart. She thought she could win an argument against someone who argues for a living. She thought her righteous indignation would overwhelm his wit. She thought being a duchess gave her an edge against a man who spent his entire career puncturing exactly that kind of self-importance. Within 20 minutes, she would discover what every politician, pundit, and power broker who'd faced Jon Stewart had learned. You don't come for the king of common sense unless you're prepared to have your contradictions exposed, your talking points dismantled, and your exit filmed for posterity. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you hit subscribe and smash that like button. We bring you the most shocking celebrity moments every single week. Now, let's get into what really happened in that studio. The Daily Show studio was unusually quiet. No audience tonight, just 2 chairs positioned across from each other, minimal crew, cameras capturing every angle. This was a special segment, a one-on-one conversation that had been negotiated for weeks after Meghan's team made clear she wanted to address Jon's previous commentary directly. Jon had agreed, somewhat amused by the demand. He'd said things about Meghan, observations about her media strategy, jokes about the victimhood industrial complex, commentary on the gap between her privacy claims and her publicity appetite. Nothing cruel, just honest. The kind of observations that anyone paying attention had already made. Apparently, she'd been paying attention. Jon settled into his chair, a notepad beside him that he probably wouldn't need. He'd been doing this too long to rely on notes. The questions were already in his head, and more importantly, so were the follow-ups. The follow-ups were always where it got interesting. The door opened, and Meghan Markle entered. Her expression was set in something that tried to be pleasant, but landed closer to combative. She crossed the studio floor with purposeful strides, and settled into her chair without offering a greeting. "Meghan, thanks for doing this." "Jon." The single word carried the temperature of a glacier. Jon smiled. He loved a hostile guest. They were always more interesting. "So, I understand you have some issues with things I've said about you." Meghan's eyes narrowed. "I have issues with a lot of things you've said. About me, about my husband, about what we're trying to accomplish." "Great, let's get into it. That's what we're here for." "Are we? Because I was told this would be a conversation. Your previous comments suggest you're more interested in cheap jokes than actual dialogue." Jon nodded thoughtfully. "I make jokes. It's kind of my thing. I've made jokes about everyone. Presidents, prime ministers, popes. You're in distinguished company. I'm not looking for your company at all. I'm looking for accountability." "Accountability for what? Making observations about publicly available information? That's what I do, Meghan. I watch people say things, and then I comment on whether those things make sense. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes that's funny." Meghan leaned forward, her voice sharpening. "You called me a case study in having your cake and eating it too. You said I complained about media intrusion while actively inviting media. You implied my suffering wasn't genuine." Jon shrugged. "I implied your suffering and your media strategy are sometimes in tension. That's not the same as saying your suffering isn't real. Both things can be true simultaneously." "That's a very convenient distinction." "It's an accurate distinction. You can genuinely suffer and also leverage that suffering for commercial purposes. Many people do. I'm not judging the choice, I'm naming it." Naming it sounds a lot like judging it. Only if you think being named is the same as being criticized. I described what I observed. If the description feels critical, maybe examine why. Meghan's face flushed with frustration, but she kept her composure. "You've spent years making fun of me on this show." "Not years, a few segments, maybe 20 minutes total over several years. You're not that central to our content, Meghan. No offense." The dismissal clearly stung. Meghan had come expecting to be the focus of sustained mockery. Learning she was merely an occasional target seemed worse somehow. Those segments reached millions of people, as did your Netflix documentary. and your Oprah interview, and your husband's book, and all the other media you've done. I'm not sure my 20 minutes outweighs your 100 hours. That's different. I was telling my own story, and I was commenting on it. That's how public discourse works. You tell your story, I offer perspective. The audience decides what they think. That's not unfair, that's democracy. It's unfair when the perspective is biased against me. Jon tilted his head. What bias? I don't know you. I have no personal stake in whether you succeed or fail. I watched what you put out publicly and commented on the contradictions I noticed. That's not bias, that's attention. Selective attention. You focused on things that made me look bad. I focused on things that were interesting. Contradictions are interesting. When someone says they want privacy and then does a 6-hour Netflix documentary, that's interesting. When someone complains about tabloid coverage and then gives tabloids constant content through public appearances, that's interesting. I didn't make those contradictions, you did. I just pointed at them. Meghan's voice rose slightly. Context matters. There's a reason for everything I've done. I'm sure there is, but reasons don't erase contradictions. They explain them. You can have excellent reasons for contradictory behavior. That doesn't make the behavior less contradictory. Meghan shifted tactics, her expression hardening. Let's talk about specific things you've said. You called the Oprah interview a masterclass in strategic victimhood. You said I turned trauma into a brand. You suggested that. Jon held up a hand. I know what I've said. I've said a lot of things. Here's the thing about my show. I comment on power. Celebrities, politicians, institutions. You are now a person of significant power. You have platforms that reach millions. You have wealth most people can't imagine. You have influence over public discourse. When you have that much power, you get commented on. That's the deal. I don't have power. I have platforms that I've built despite constant opposition. Those platforms are power, Meghan. A $100 million Netflix deal is power. A best-selling memoir is power. The ability to shape narratives that millions of people believe is power. You're not the underdog you present yourself as. I'm an underdog compared to the institution I left. You're an underdog compared to the British monarchy. Congratulations. So is everyone else. Compared to normal people, the audience watching this, you're extraordinarily privileged and powerful. The question is whether you can acknowledge that while also acknowledging your struggles. I've acknowledged plenty. You've acknowledged struggle. You haven't acknowledged privilege, not really. Every time someone mentions your advantages, you redirect to your disadvantages. That's not balance, that's deflection. Meghan's eyes flashed. I didn't have advantages. I worked for everything I have. You worked for some of it. Then you married into one of the most famous families on earth. That's also part of the story. The work and the luck and the privilege, they all coexist. Acknowledging one doesn't diminish the others. You're trying to minimize my achievements. I'm trying to contextualize your complaints. There's a difference. The tension in the room was palpable now. Jon remained calm. He always remained calm. But there was a sharpness in his observations that cut through Meghan's defenses. Let's change the subject, Meghan said abruptly. Sure. How's Harry? The shift in Meghan's demeanor was immediate. Walls going up, expression closing off. I'd prefer to keep this interview focused on me. Jon's eyebrows rose. But you just said I've been unfair to both you and your husband. Shouldn't he be part of this conversation? He can speak for himself. He has, extensively. And you've spoken for him too, in various interviews. Why is he off limits now? Because I'm setting a boundary. A boundary you didn't set when you were promoting your joint projects. The Netflix documentary featured both of you. The discussions of leaving the royal family were about both of you. Why is he suddenly private? Meghan's jaw tightened. Some things should remain private. Jon laughed, a genuine surprised laugh. I'm sorry, did you just say that? You, who've done more to publicize your private life than almost anyone in recent memory, are invoking privacy? My choices about what to share don't obligate me to share everything. No, but they do make privacy claims a bit hollow. You can't publish your husband's family disputes in a best-selling memoir and then act shocked when people want to discuss your husband. The book was about his experience, which you've discussed in every interview since. You're not the gatekeeper of his story, Meghan, but you've positioned yourself as such whenever it suits you. When it's time to promote, Harry's fair game. When it's time to deflect, Suddenly he's private. That's not principle, that's strategy. Everything I do gets called strategy. Because everything you do is strategic. That's not an insult, it's an observation. You're very strategic, very calculated. Every appearance, every statement, every project is carefully positioned. That's fine, that's how successful people operate. But don't pretend it's spontaneous emotion when it's clearly planned. Meghan stood up slightly, then sat back down, a false start that betrayed her agitation. You're deliberately misunderstanding me. I'm deliberately listening to you, and what I hear is someone who wants credit for authenticity while being extremely calculated. Those things don't naturally coexist. You can be authentic, or you can be strategic, but presenting strategy as authenticity is where I get skeptical. I am authentic. Then why does everything you say sound like it was drafted by a committee? I've watched your interviews. The language is too perfect. The emotional beats are too precise. Real people stumble, contradict themselves, say things they regret. You speak in paragraphs. Maybe I'm just articulate. Maybe. Or maybe every public appearance is so thoroughly prepared that spontaneity becomes impossible. I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying you're performing. And there's a gap between performance and authenticity that's worth noting. Meghan's voice turned icy. This is exactly what I expected from you. Attack the woman's credibility instead of engaging with her substance. What substance? You came here to confront me about my comments. I've explained my comments. You haven't refuted them. You've just expressed displeasure that I made them. That's not substance, that's complaint. I'm not complaining. You've been complaining since you sat down. About my coverage, about public perception, about how unfairly you've been treated. At some point, the complaining itself becomes the story, not what you've endured, but how you've responded to it. And your response has been constant public grievance. That's not healing, Meghan. That's brand management. Meghan slammed her hand on the arm of her chair. I'm not managing a brand. I'm living my life. Your life is a brand. That's not my doing. It's yours. You've trademarked names, launched companies, signed deals that monetize your personal story. You've built a business around being Meghan Markle. There's nothing wrong with that. This is America. We love entrepreneurs. But don't act like I'm the one who commercialized your existence. You did that. I'm just pointing it out. The room fell silent for a moment. Jon watched Meghan with an expression that wasn't hostile, more curious, maybe even sympathetic. But his observations kept landing with devastating precision. You know what I find interesting? He said, breaking the silence. You came here to confront me. You wanted to put me in my place. But you haven't actually disputed anything I've said. You've said my comments were unfair. You've said I don't understand. But you haven't pointed to a single thing I've said that was factually wrong. Meghan's face reddened. Your framing is wrong. My framing is observation. I've watched what you've done and described it. If the description is unflattering, maybe the actions are the problem, not the description. You're twisting everything. I'm repeating your own words and actions back to you. If that feels like twisting, maybe examine the original shape. That's incredibly condescending. It's incredibly honest. Those feel the same when you're not used to pushback. Meghan stood up fully now, her composure finally cracking. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. Jon didn't stand. He just looked up at her with that infuriating calm. Probably, but not for the reasons you think. What's that supposed to mean? You came here thinking you'd put me in my place. You thought righteous indignation would overwhelm my observations. But indignation is an argument. Being upset about what someone said isn't the same as proving them wrong. And you haven't proven me wrong about anything. You've just expressed displeasure, loudly, repeatedly, and with increasing hostility. Because you won't engage fairly. I've done nothing but engage. You're the one who keeps trying to end the conversation. Every time I make an observation you can't counter, you deflect, accuse me of bias, or invoke privacy. Those are exit strategies, not engagement. Meghan grabbed her purse, her movements sharp with anger. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by someone who's made a career out of being smug. I've made a career out of being honest. Sometimes honesty looks like smugness to people who aren't used to it. There's nothing honest about what you do. You pick targets and attack them for entertainment. I pick contradictions and highlight them for clarity. Sometimes that's entertaining, but entertainment isn't the goal. Understanding is. And I understand you pretty well, Meghan. Better than you seem to understand yourself. You don't know anything about me. I know what you've shown me, and what you've shown me, both tonight and over the past few years, is someone who wants to be seen as a victim and a victor simultaneously, who wants sympathy for her struggles and admiration for her success, who wants privacy when it's convenient and publicity when it serves her. Those contradictions aren't character flaws, they're human, but the refusal to acknowledge them is where it gets problematic. Meghan's voice rose to something close to a shout. I acknowledge plenty. You acknowledge what serves your narrative. When criticism is racist, you call it out. When criticism is legitimate, you call it racist. That's not acknowledgement, that's manipulation. How dare you? I dare because it's true. I've watched it happen. Valid questions about your statements get labeled as attacks. Reasonable skepticism gets called bigotry. It's effective. People are afraid to challenge you because they don't want to be accused of racism. But it's also transparent to anyone paying attention. Meghan stood frozen, her face contorted with barely suppressed rage. You're going to regret this. Jon smiled slightly. I've been hearing that for 30 years, still waiting for the regret to kick in. This interview is over. It was over before it started. You came here to win an argument, not to have a conversation. When winning proved impossible, you decided to leave. That's your right. But it's also very telling. What's it telling? That you can't engage with criticism without catastrophizing it. That any challenge to your narrative becomes evidence of persecution. That you've surrounded yourself with people who agree with everything you say, and you've forgotten how to handle someone who doesn't. Meghan pointed at Jon, her hand shaking. You're not a challenger, you're a bully. I've asked you questions and made observations. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't insulted you. I've simply refused to accept your framing without examination. If that's bullying, the word has lost all meaning. Your observations are attacks. My observations are observations. Your inability to distinguish between the two is exactly the problem I've been describing. When everything is an attack, nothing is. When everyone is a bully, no one is. You've diluted these concepts by overusing them, and now you're surprised that people don't take your complaints seriously. People do take me seriously. Some do, others have grown tired. And the tired ones aren't wrong, Meghan. When the complaint is constant, people stop listening. That's not their failure, it's yours. You've cried wolf so many times that the actual wolves don't register anymore. Meghan walked toward the door, then turned back for one final confrontation. You know what your problem is, Jon? You think being cynical is the same as being wise. You think doubting people makes you smart. But all you really are is someone who tears things down because you can't build anything yourself. Jon nodded slowly, considering the accusation. Maybe, but here's what I notice. I've built a career on asking questions and exposing contradictions. You've built a career on being contradictory and resenting questions. One of us is consistent. The other keeps changing the rules depending on what's convenient. I don't change rules. Privacy is sacred, except when you're promoting something. Family is off limits, except when you're writing about them. Questions are welcome, except when they're challenging. The rules change constantly, Meghan, and they always change in your favor. That's not principle, that's privilege. The privilege of someone who's never had to play by the same rules as everyone else. Meghan's voice dropped to something cold and final. I've always played by harder rules than everyone else, because of my race, because of my gender, because of the family I married into. Jon met her gaze steadily. You face challenges because of those things. I'm not disputing that. But you've also received opportunities because of those things, including the opportunity to be a duchess, which came specifically because of who you married. The challenges and the opportunities coexist. Acknowledging one doesn't mean ignoring the other. But you only want to talk about the challenges, and that's what makes the conversation frustrating. I talk about what matters. You talk about what positions you as sympathetic. There's a difference, and I've spent 30 years learning to spot that difference. It's the core of what I do. So when you come in here and try to position yourself as purely victimized, I notice. Not because I'm biased against you, because I'm trained to see exactly what you're doing. Meghan stood at the door, one hand on the handle, seemingly unable to leave without a final word. History will vindicate me. Jon smiled sadly. Maybe, or maybe history will see someone who had enormous advantages and spent most of her time complaining about them. Someone who could have used her platform for almost anything and chose to use it for grievance. Someone who had everything and still felt wronged. He paused. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you find peace. But peace isn't something you find by arguing with everyone who sees you clearly. At some point, you have to stop and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the people noticing contradictions aren't the problem. Meghan opened the door. Goodbye, Jon. Goodbye, Meghan. Thanks for coming. It was exactly what I expected. The door closed behind her with a decisive click. Jon sat alone in the studio for a moment, then turned to face the camera. Well, that happened. He rubbed his temples. I want to be clear about something. I didn't set out to have a confrontation. She wanted to confront me about my previous commentary, and I explained that commentary. She didn't like my explanations. That's fine. She doesn't have to like them. But not liking something isn't the same as refuting it. He leaned back in his chair. Here's what I notice about conversations like this. They never actually engage with the substance. She was upset that I'd called her strategic, but she didn't argue that she wasn't strategic. She just didn't like the label. She was upset that I'd noted contradictions between her privacy claims and her publicity actions, but she didn't explain how those things weren't contradictory. She just resented me noticing. Jon shrugged. That's not conversation, that's complaint. And I've been doing this too long to pretend complaint is the same as dialogue. I'll continue commenting on public figures who seem contradictory. That's my job. If they want to come on and explain themselves, I'm happy to listen. But if they just want to express displeasure that I noticed something, that's not really productive for anyone. He looked directly into the camera. We'll be back next week with actual dialogue, hopefully. The interview lasted 22 minutes before Meghan walked out. Its impact would last considerably longer. Jon Stewart continued doing what he'd always done, asking the questions nobody else would ask, noticing the contradictions nobody else would mention, and refusing to apologize for clarity. Meghan Markle returned to Montecito, to her foundation work, to her ongoing media strategy. But the confrontation followed her, proof that her narrative couldn't withstand someone who simply refused to accept it without examination. Some battles you win by fighting harder. Others you lose by picking the wrong opponent. Jon Stewart had been dismantling powerful people's contradictions for 3 decades. He wasn't about to stop for a duchess. What do you think? Was Jon too harsh, or did Meghan deserve every observation? Who would you want to see on The Daily Show next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video to help it reach more people. Subscribe to our channel for more explosive celebrity moment.